exercise around that. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sebastian Orbzit. Okay, he is a actually have you met him before already? Maybe in some of your shadowing? Or? Okay, good. So he is a nuclear radiologist, which I think you're the first one to speak to the class about this area. So I just asked him to provide some background to radiology and what he does, and maybe some of the needs too that he sees. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, so I'm from nuclear medicine. Now they actually call it molecular imaging. It's going from nuclear medicine because we use small molecules to identify what's happening in the body. So you have different modalities in radiology that you can figure out what's happening for diagnosis and staging. You have CT, MRI, ultrasound, and then you have positron emission tomography and single photon emission tomography. So the two that I'll talk about briefly is the positron emission tomography first, and then the single photon emission tomography. So, has anybody heard of positron emission tomography before? What have you seen it used for? Has anybody?
What have you seen for research?
Okay.
Mouse models.
Okay, for mouse models.
Yeah.
Okay. It's used heavily actually in pharmaceutical industry to assess drugs. If you have a drug candidate, you can make a small molecule and then image animals in vivo and test your targets. It's quantitative and it's molecular and it's non-invasive. So yeah,
Seeing where, exactly where we're trying to do a delivery system and go to a specific area, and so we're able to map that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so the first one I'll talk about is positron emission tomography, and here we have a picture of a molecule. Does anybody recognize what this kind of looks like? What does this look like? Anybody with a chemistry background? So this is an analog of glucose, okay? It's called deoxyglucose, but here it's bound to 18F fluorine that comes from the cyclotron. So now you have radioactive fluorine that's reactive for 2 hours, radioactive deoxyglucose, and you can inject it through an IV into a patient, and it's going to distribute throughout the body, okay? And then you can take a picture of it, but not only is it a picture, what's important, it's not only is it a picture, but it's actually, you can actually quantitate the rate of uptake of glucose into the different parts of the body. Okay, so how is that going to be helpful? For cancer, we can quantitate how fast cancer is metabolizing glucose, and that's going to be used for ATP generation, for DNA generation through pentose phosphate pathway. Okay, for Alzheimer's, we can see decreased metabolism in the brain, for seizures, for heart viability. The main thing about positron emission tomography is these isotopes, when they decay, they emit 2 gamma rays at 180 degrees. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to design a detector system that will allow you to capture and identify 2 gamma rays simultaneously. So you guys might, you might have heard about CT, CAT scans, right? So how does that work? You have X-rays from the outside. You spin this source around the patient, and you have the detector on the other side, right? And you shoot them through, and you essentially get you reconstruct the image, you get the density of the body, okay? Well, this is different. This is where you inject the tracer, and it's radiating out, okay? And you can see a patient under the camera here in this picture, and then these are detectors all around, and you can see there was an event that took place right here where you had 1 gamma ray going one way, 1 going the other. And because these 2 detectors detected a gamma ray simultaneously, then we have to figure out, okay, well, it probably started someplace along this line, okay? And so you can reconstruct this by actually using the newest time of flight approach, which is something that like a Navy SEAL would use to, identify targets, how far a target is. They'll shoot light and it'll come back. You can identify the distance. You can actually reconstruct these images in 3 dimension, knowing exactly where the source came from. With CT, you actually don't know where it came from. You know that it only came along a specific straight line. So, so this is the example of a PET scan, and this could be used for cancer imaging. This is an image of the entire body of the patient, and you can see that there is metabolism in the brain, okay? But also there's cancer right here in the mediastinum. This would be an example of a PET scan that's normal in a patient that's spinning, and then here this would be abnormal. You see the little dots there, so these are all cancer. Okay, and then you can actually go in and click on it and quantitate and know how fast the metabolism is. So typically a patient would actually start out like this, you give chemo, you can quantitate, it goes from here to this, and you can quantitate metabolism, okay, of the, but you have all kinds of different tracers now that you can make. So you can get into radiochemistry, and we're looking at glucose, but then there's thymidine, guanine, fluorine for bone metastases. The newest applications would be for Alzheimer's disease, okay, where we have several commercial products coming out of GE Healthcare and a couple other companies. So we're looking at, not only can we assess metabolism, but we can actually, for example, quantify the amount of amyloid in the brain, okay, in a patient. And we're doing that as part of the IDEAS study, for Alzheimer's. So there are all kinds of tracers that you can, that you can get into. However, it's not. So I showed you the PET scan, but actually, no one's really doing PET right now. Everyone's doing hybrid imaging. So it's going to be PET CT or PET MRI. Okay. And so you can see this is UCLA. This was about 12 years ago, and one of the first PET scanners when they bolted the PET scan with a CT scan. And then the images are hybrid, so you actually fuse them together. So you get the anatomy plus the, you have the anatomy plus the molecular aspect of what's happening. So, that's PET. And as far as what the needs are, okay, and one of the needs that I can tell you about is, when you think about the half-life of the isotope, so for when you develop these isotopes, what people think about is, for the 18F glucose, the half-life here is 2 hours. And this will be, just going back here, so this will be made, the 18F will be made in a cyclotron. So that's in Sorrento Valley, okay? And then they have to put it, in a car and ship it to all the hospitals, okay? And then you have 2 hours, so they have to make more, and then within 2 hours it's going to decay. So then what has happened is, since this is reimbursed by Medicare, and now we have nationally, there's these particle accelerators sort of everywhere, and looking at throughout US, now you're looking at the, Europe, and then through China, everywhere people are putting these cyclotrons, okay? And so the isotope that they're mostly using is the 18F, because pretty much you can, if your location, in point A, in this location, you can get pretty far in 2 hours, whether you put it on a plane, and then move it, to a car. So that's great, but what we want to get into is some of these other tracers, like for example ammonia, which is great for quantitative cardiac imaging, where the half-life is only 10 minutes, okay? So the problem for UCSD right now is that we can quantitate blood flow, in Sorrento, the valley where the cyclotron is. If we were to image a patient there using this isotope, but our patients actually want to come here, okay? They don't want to go over there. And we have our newest scanners are getting put in here. So for us to make a lot of 13N ammonia, we could do it, but what happens is that we would have to drive it over here really fast, and they put the cyclotron, but there's the train tracks, okay? And so then you have to time it when the train is going, and so you have to schedule the patient so that you have to schedule the patient when the train's not coming, but if the train's late, then you're in trouble, okay? So one need that people have is the fact that everyone's kind of stuck with the longer half-life isotopes. But there is, but if you go with the shorter half-life, for example, the ammonia, these are studies that are reimbursed by insurance, and you can do them, and they're quantitative, and they're really low-dose myocardial perfusion imaging studies where you can assess for coronary artery disease. It's lower dose than coronary CT angiograms, okay, quantitative. But the dilemma that people get is this transport of these isotopes. So someone said, okay, that's easy. Let's just get a drone, and we just fly it over there. Yeah, I don't know if that's so easy finding, radioactive isotopes. So that's pretty, so if this thing hits someone, or if it collided with something, it's only 10-minute half-life, which is decay, right? But I mean, if we could have a drone system right now, I mean, it would solve so many problems where you could, as an example, kind of out of the box thinking. Yeah. So it's many, and other than that, for these are all the different isotopes that people make. Other than that, for a possible need would be, these images. When you look at these images, now you're into, you're looking at hybrid imaging of the whole body, and so suddenly, it's taking me a long time to read onto one of these images. Okay, so to get to the whole body, it's a simple one's going to be 15 minutes. A difficult one could take up to an hour because I have to quantify the cancer and measure it. Okay, so ideas about machine learning, or speeding up the process of me going through the study would be super helpful, I think. part of the issue is where these images are stored. They're stored on the PACS system. So the question is, okay, if some kind of an aid in form of like AI or some type of deep networks, if it's invented, will it come from the camera manufacturer like GE or Siemens? Okay, and do I have to use a separate monitor and move all my images there because that's time consuming? Or will it come from the vendors who are actually storing the data? Okay, so that's like another need where, the reimbursement is becoming lower and lower through Medicare for reading these images, but they're actually the advancement into molecular imaging is like there's tons of research and new traces are coming out that are reimbursed by Medicare, but it's taking longer and longer to read them. And it's for a bone scan sodium fluoride, it's a great study. It takes a long time to read.
And so they would reimburse right now by the procedure as opposed to by the time.
Correct.
Physician
Yeah.
time.
So so it's basically how many can I read in an hour? Yeah.
This is slightly off topic, but since you're talking about deep learning, how receptive are current radiologists and the current hospitals are to like this whole deep learning, machine AI reading images?
So I mean, I think some people are like afraid of it, but honestly, I think that's the future. That's where it's going to go, and I think it's going to accelerate, what we're doing. Yeah. So some people don't know much about it, but I think what would happen for sure is that it would speed up what they're doing, and I think once they actually see how it's helpful, like some people think it's going to replace their jobs or something like that. I don't know. I really don't see that. Just because, like today I was looking at a study and the only way I could actually figure out what's going on is I actually had to read the clinical notes to find that there was like some lymph nodes that. So I had a resident look through the study, and you can think of a resident as a deep network that's like really well trained for like 4 years, and he puts out a report, okay, and then like he misses a lymph node that's really small. But I found it not even looking at the images, I found it looking at the clinical note. So I think a deep network, it could get pretty good. I think where it can run into trouble is also how you reconstruct these images, because you're going to have different reconstruction algorithms, and some of these algorithms will actually rely on sparsity, and they will rely on the inherent sparsity of the images, and it'll be like a little bit different from different vendors. So I think these networks might struggle depending who puts them out. So whether it's going to be specific. So Siemens puts out their deep network, is that going to work with a GE camera? Like it might not work that well just because there's so many different ways to reconstruct images. So another modality that I wanted to tell you about, just briefly, is, just close this. So that was, this is another modality that I wanted to tell you about, which is the single photon emission tomography. And this also is now combined with CT, so the newest cameras are combined with CT, so it's hybrid imaging. And here, there are lots of applications. Lots of these are reimbursed, from neurological to to cancer. Lots of different applications that have CPT codes. The SPECT camera only has a single photon that's emitted. Okay, let me see if I can just show you an example of. I think it has a single photon that's emitted, and so you have to have these lead tubes that are only going to allow you to accept photons that are perpendicular to the detector. So because of that, these SPECT cameras are less sensitive than the PET, but they're still really good for lots of applications. For example, like Parkinson's disease, it's great. We're identifying Parkinson's disease where the neurologist doesn't really know what's happening with like DAT scans, for instance, with the cocaine analog. So that's another modality that we're using, and now that has been combined with CT. And so here what has happened is kind of interesting, because originally SPECT developed without the CT, okay? But now the CT has been added, and it's really helpful to actually read the images together, okay? But it takes longer, okay, to do it. And the CPT codes haven't like really advanced, where the CPT code's only for the SPECT part, but not the CT part. So
Could you just explain real quick to them what a CPT code and how that really influences business?
Absolutely. Actually, I have one more slide after this.
Sure.
So I'll talk to you guys about the CPT code next. Okay. So basically the main point of this slide here is that that's another modality, and the main thing to know here is that these isotopes, they're typically longer half-lives. Okay, so it's not as much an issue of transport for these. Okay, because you can transport them from like a different state, for instance. But it's an issue of of like Medicare reimbursing, for example, like for 3-dimensional images. So like it started 2-dimensional and we had reimbursement for dimensional. Now we moved to 3-dimensional plus CT, and then insurances and Medicare have kind of lagged. And so for product development, in this sphere, or even let's say you want to design, this would be a project that we're looking at, for example, is doing artificial intelligence deep network to read Parkinson's disease scans. Okay, so that that one is reimbursed for 3-dimensional imaging. Okay, but for lungs, if you wanted to design some software, it's not actually reimbursed by Medicare. So these are some of the issues that you could get into with. But let me just show you what the images look like. So, for instance, this here is a 2-dimensional image. Okay, which is what we used to look at. But here we actually end up with a 3-dimensional image of the CT plus the this is reactive iodine, and we kind of thought that this would be a bone metastases in a thyroid cancer study, but with the SPECT CT we can tell, oh, that's in the intestine. So that's this is a cross section of the pelvis, and that's in the intestine. So the hybrid imaging allows us to see a lot more. The reimbursement for the insurance is for this image, this the 2-dimensional image of the body from the head down the toes. But we want to read these kinds of images with color. Okay, and we don't quite have the reimbursement there. Here's another example where, this is a 2-dimensional image that's like super messy. No one really knows what's going on, and that's the little single focus here. We thought, well, is that in the bowel? It actually turns out that it's in the rib, and that one was cancer metastases, from thyroid cancer. So, the main points that I wanted to get across is that you've got 2 of these modalities, and they use different types of isotopes. One emits a single gamma ray, and the other emits 2. And one is, the PET is newer, okay? And it's more sensitive and it's quantitative. The SPECT is, the newest thing about SPECT is starting to become quantitative, okay? Through some very interesting math that people have been developing. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about is about some of the concepts for like business development that are applicable to radiology, but also just like medical applications as well, okay? And so I have these 5 here, okay, and so we can think about, like, it's kind of like I'm just going to throw some questions at you guys. So let's say that you have thought about your product, and you're going to start a company, or maybe you license this product out, right? So I guess the question is, how would you be affected by the HIPAA Act? How is that going to be a problem? Has anybody heard of HIPAA before? Okay. So how is that? What do you have to know about HIPAA, or what do you have to consider when you are developing a product?
Patient information, privacy.
Right, exactly. So it's looking into into HIPAA. It's it came out in 1996. Okay, and basically the idea is that patient information has to be super secure, and you can so there's specific rules that you have to follow, and if you don't, then there's criminal penalties, okay, if you don't follow these rules, okay? So there's the privacy rule, which is paper and electronic, and then there's the security rule, which is electronic only, okay? So the main thing that, that you might need to know, well, one of the important things that you need to know about HIPAA is that it doesn't help you to develop your product, okay? It makes it a lot harder to develop your product, okay? So how is it gonna make it harder? Well, we see it's just from research. So, we're doing a lot of research where we aren't even trying to start companies, okay? We just want to do a project. And what happens, and this is, what has happened is that, through the implementation of HIPAA, because of following all of these rules, for example, this is from University of Michigan, the ability to follow patients after a heart attack has dropped from 96 to 34% at University of Michigan. Just because they can't follow them, because people haven't signed in paperwork, so since they introduced it. Or, for example, in cancer, this is University of Michigan cancer prevention. 70% decrease in being able to get patients, okay? Tripling time of spent recruiting patients. Tripling recruitment costs, okay? So what happens is that, let's say that you have your device, or, you have your product that you want to develop. So we have a project with virtual reality, and we're using virtual reality to assess patient movement, but patients also get a brain scan,
So it's the virtual reality test is like 10 minutes, okay? And for us to do the 10-minute test of virtual reality on the patient, after they get the brain scan later with that scan, there's a stack of paperwork. And we approach the patient like, hey, we have this really cool test that you can do. It's 10 minutes. And they see the paperwork. It's like, oh, well, how long is it going to take me to read this? So that's really that's where the patient, that we are not giving the patients that we could, because patients just say, I don't want to do it. Okay, although they have to be there for an hour before the injection and 3 hours later for the scan, they'd rather just kind of sit there instead of going through this paperwork. So it's basically like lengthy, and so that's, if you're developing a product, you have to think about, I had a great idea, but it's gonna be harder for me to get these patients because of the paperwork that's privacy related. What about have you guys heard about the High Tech Act, or how that's going to impact your product development? So that's kind of similar to HIPAA, and basically this came out of, essentially it came out from Medicare, and the government was instructed to spend like $25 billion to basically make medical records electronic, and we have seen that through our medical records are electronic. Scripts is going in that direction. There's been all these incentives and investment. It's really great. So that helps research and product development because you get all this patient data. The only thing is that now if you have a breach, if you're developing a product and if you have and your product involves more than 500 people, and suddenly you have been breached somehow by some kind of malware or something, then you have to tell the media, okay, if it's more than 500, and everyone has to know about it. So if you keep it under 500 when you develop your product, so if something happens, then you don't have to tell the news, right? It's like over the news. So if you can. What is Human Research Predictions Program? How is that going to impact your product development? Any ideas? This is the IRB. How's that going to develop how you develop your business?
Isn't something to do with proving that your device is safe enough to start trials on humans, or?
Yeah, so the HRPP is this is at UCSD, but essentially anytime you're doing any type of experiments with people, it's even if you're doing even if you're asking people to complete a survey. Okay, let's say that's your stuff. You're just developing. Let's say you're developing a survey on an iPad, and that's your product, right? You have to have the HRPP sign off on it through ethics, okay? And the main thing that they're looking at is make sure that HIPAA satisfied, that you have, you have all of these passwords, you have double password protection. The medical records are separate from the patient's names, okay? So that's number one. But the second thing, what is the risk versus the benefit is the big thing, okay? And so that's very important when you develop your product. So I'll give you an example of how this could play out. So risk versus benefit, if you're developing a product where you have to go in surgically and do something, that's pretty high risk, okay? And so the benefit of, if it's developed, has to be really high, okay, if you are developing a product that's high risk. If you're developing a surrogate on an iPad that's going to help you diagnose depression, that's pretty low risk, and so all you have to do is make sure that it's HIPAA protected, okay? And this could get through the IRB easily, okay, through UCSD. It's going to take about 2 months. But if you have to, if you're going to be putting a catheter in, or interventional radiology, so you're talking about a different approach, they'll look at it and they're going to see what's the risk, how are the patients going to be benefiting, okay, and they may just say, okay, this is just, the risk is too high, we're not approving, and you will not be able to do it. So what you try to do with IRB is you try to, if you're doing invasive stuff, you try to get into a situation where somebody's already doing something invasive, and you just kind of add on to what they're doing. Okay, so for example, we had a project with systems biology where we needed blood from the heart. Okay, because we wanted to look at the system metabolites to apply it to this metabolic network. So we thought, okay, well, we can get a grant, get it funded, and then recruit patients so that we can put a catheter into their heart and draw blood. Well, that's super invasive. And the systems biology project is not going to be that much of a benefit. It's going to help us. So instead of us recruiting patients and doing all of this on patients that have nothing to, it wouldn't really benefit them, we found a cardiologist from electrophysiology that was already going in there with the catheter to put in a dual chamber pacemaker. So they're already in there. So actually, with our study, it's really you're not really adding any risk because they are already in there. But we also needed to get arterial blood, which is actually kind of risky, even from the wrist. And so they kind of looked at that. Okay, is the benefit going to be enough to actually poke someone in the artery? Because vein is no problem, but poking somebody in the artery is like you could do a lot of damage. So risk versus benefits, I think that's very important when you develop your product. Okay. And so if you're doing like wireless communications, it's going to be more the privacy issue, you know. But if you're doing devices, then it's going to be the invasiveness of it. Okay. You have a question?
Yeah, I vaguely recall something along these lines where if you don't have an existing alternative to a procedure you are trying to suggest or to use, even if it's invasive, and if the number of patients that you're statistically targeting, you know, in the country are below a certain number, then you can still do it, provided the patient approves that yes, I'm fine with. Is that something you're familiar with, or is that something that falls under this, or is it?
Yeah, I think it would fall under this. So yeah, if it's if nothing exists and you're the only potential solution, then you get the approval. Yeah. But the way these projects are structured, another example. So with the virtual reality, right? I could basically try to apply for a grant and ask people to be imaged, image their brain. But that's like radiation. It's a little bit of radiation, but it is radiation, and IRB would not approve that. So for like some company to kind of do what I'm doing, where they're just going to recruit patients, IRB is not going to approve it because this little bit of radiation is too much of a risk just so you can do some virtual reality tests. So what we're doing is we're actually getting patients who are already coming in for a brain scan. They would have it one way or another, and we're using those patients to actually apply our test. So whenever you can with your device or your idea, try to identify a doctor that's already kind of doing. He's doing something that you want to do already, and there's no added risk. And then you can get your IRB approval. Okay, so that's really important. So I think I kind of participated in the MEET program, and then I noticed like there was some solutions presented by engineers, and there was a panel of engineers that said, "Oh, that's a great idea," but I think they even got funded. But I was looking at it like I don't know if IRB is going to approve this. So so just another PACS. This is a system that we use to store medical images, and the format is DICOM. Okay, and so all the medical images are stored on there, and it's how we access images, how we read them, and how we store them. Picture archiving communication system, and the DICOM is the format. So you guys might be familiar with like JPEG, right, for instance, or some other formats. The DICOM format is the used for radiology. What else? I think there was one for CPT. Okay, how about CPT code? How is CPT? So this is the last question that I had for you guys because we're out of time. So how is CPT code going to CPT codes? How would CPT codes affect your business development? Does anybody know? Or go ahead.
So that's going to determine whether or not Medicare is going to just give disbursements for the treatment?
Right, that is correct. So, so these are CPT codes are basically it is the service that we provide right now. That's how billing is done under this system. So if you are doing a chest radiograph, there's a CPT code. There's certain reimbursement for it. Okay. And so these are CPT codes for radiology. They're listed here. Nuclear medicine is listed down here. So as an example of business development, where you think about starting a product and going to investors, getting it funded. Okay. That would be used in patients and not like in mice, for instance. So nuclear medicine, we have, we're doing two-dimensional imaging of the lungs right now. And we have, let's say somebody wants to develop a software that's going to allow us to image lungs in 3 dimensions, okay? And then they want to sell this software for like $80,000, okay? Well, the problem is that there's no CPT code for 3-dimensional lung imaging, okay? And so let's say this gets developed, who's going to buy it? Because you can't really get reimbursed for it, okay? Well, so GE and Siemens Healthcare, they actually developed this software, and they're trying to sell it to us. And so we could still buy it because it's great. It's really awesome. And the only reason we buy it is if like Scripps buys it, so we don't compete with Scripps. But we would essentially be doing the 2-dimensional image, bill for the CPT code, like low reimbursement to dimension, we'd be doing the 3D for free. Okay. So so it's possible that if this 3-dimensional imaging really changes outcomes, it's about changing outcomes. That's how you get CPT codes issued. If you can show you can change outcomes. If this 3-dimensional imaging really changes outcomes, then Medicare would issue at some CPT code for 3-dimensional imaging at some point, but it takes lots of data. So typically, if I think from the investor point of view, if they are looking at your product, if your product can go under a specific CPT code where you can have reimbursement, then you're more likely to be invested in. So as example, Cardiology Group actually developed this really awesome software that looks at potential for, I think it was potential for stroke using ultrasound, and they have gotten funding for research. But I spoke with them, and we don't have a CPT code, and there's a competitor that hasn't gotten a CPT code for like 2 or 3 years. So it's kind of like a little bit of a dead end. Okay, so that's all I have for you guys.
Well,
So
thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be following up with you.